Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with 1 like, 1 subscribe, and 1 share.
Why did my husband stop talking? The silent morning that changed everything. Have you ever woken up next to someone and felt like a complete stranger? That was me, 3 years into my marriage, lying in our suburban Boston home, watching my husband sip his black coffee in complete silence. Not the comfortable silence of two people who know each other deeply. No, this was the kind of silence that screams, crawls under your skin, and makes you question everything you thought you knew about love. My husband, an American man I had married after what I believed was a fairy tale romance, had stopped talking to me. Not angry silence. Not the silent treatment you give when you're fighting. This was something far more terrifying. He simply had nothing to say. And the worst part? I had no idea why. I replayed every conversation, every argument, every moment of our marriage like a broken record, searching for the moment I had broken us. Was it my accent? My broken English that still stumbled over words after years of living here? Was it the way I cooked Vietnamese food that he pretended to love but secretly hated? I spiraled into a rabbit hole of self-doubt, convinced that I had failed as a wife, as a woman, as a human being. My friends told me to give him space. My mother, thousands of miles away in Vietnam, told me to pray. But nobody told me what I desperately needed to hear, that sometimes, silence in a marriage has nothing to do with you. And everything to do with a language neither of you knows how to speak. You see, I had spent years trying to perfect my English, memorizing vocabulary lists, watching grammar videos, practicing pronunciation in front of the mirror. But I had never once stopped to ask myself, what if the problem wasn't my English? What if the problem was that I was using the wrong language entirely to communicate with the man I loved? And what if the key to understanding him wasn't in learning more words, but in learning to listen to what he wasn't saying? It was a Tuesday morning. Ordinary in every way except for the fact that I had just made a decision that would change everything. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat across from him. And then, in my slow, imperfect English, I said something I had never said before. Something that made him look up from his coffee for the first time in weeks. Something that broke the silence forever. But you'll have to wait until the next part to find out what that was. Because what happened next, and what I discovered about my husband, my marriage, and myself, was nothing short of a miracle that I never saw coming. How did we get here? The American man who fell for a Vietnamese girl. You're probably wondering how I ended up in that kitchen, staring at my silent American husband, feeling like a ghost in my own marriage. Let me take you back to the beginning, not to Vietnam, but right here in the United States, where our love story actually started. I met Mark at a coffee shop in downtown Chicago, for years before that terrible Tuesday morning. He was tall, had this ridiculously warm smile, and spoke with a Midwestern drawl that made everything sound like a gentle hug. I was working part-time at a small Vietnamese bakery, my English still shaky, my confidence even shakier. But Mark didn't care about my imperfect grammar. He didn't laugh when I mixed up beach and bitch in front of his friends. Okay, maybe he laughed a little. But in that adorable way that made me fall harder. We fell in love the way people do in movies, fast, hard, and completely oblivious to reality. He proposed to me on a rooftop in Boston, 6 months after we moved there for his new job, and I said yes without hesitation. I thought I knew him. I thought I understood American culture from the countless movies and TV shows I had binge-watched to improve my English. But here's the thing about language learning that nobody tells you: you can memorize every word in the dictionary and still miss the most important conversations entirely. See, when I was learning English, I focused on vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar, the building blocks. What I didn't learn was the emotional vocabulary, the unspoken rules, the silent languages that exist in every relationship, but are completely different in every culture. In Vietnam, we say I love you by cooking your favorite meal. In America, they say it by, well, I was still trying to figure that out. The first year of our marriage was magical, but it was also confusing. Mark would come home from work, sit on the couch, and scroll through his phone in silence. In my culture, silence meant something was wrong. So I would ask, "Are you okay? Are you mad at me? Did I do something wrong?" He would look up, confused, and say, "I'm fine, babe. Just decompressing." That word, decompressing, I had to look it up. It meant relaxing. But in my mind, silence and relaxation didn't belong in the same sentence. I was reading all his cues wrong, interpreting his American habits through a Vietnamese lens, and slowly building a wall between us without even realizing it. I thought I was being a good wife by asking questions. He thought I was being anxious and overbearing. We were speaking the same language, English, but we were not understanding each other at all. And then something happened that made everything worse. Something that made him pull away completely. Something that started with a tiny misunderstanding and snowballed into the silence that nearly destroyed us. I'll tell you about it in the next part, because that moment is when I truly realized my English wasn't the problem. It was how I was using it. The dinner that broke us, when English words became a wall. Let me tell you about the dinner that changed everything, the moment I now call the American nightmare. It was a Saturday evening in our Boston apartment, and Mark's boss and his wife were coming over for dinner. I had spent hours preparing a fusion meal, pho-inspired broth with a twist, spring rolls that I had practiced making perfectly, and a dessert that combined Vietnamese coconut jelly with American cheesecake. I wanted to impress them. I wanted to show Mark that I could be the perfect American wife, gracious, charming, and fluent in both languages. But here's the thing about trying too hard when your English is still a work in progress: it backfires spectacularly. The evening started well. His boss, David, was a friendly guy with a loud laugh, and his wife, Sarah, asked me about my background. I told her about my love for cooking, how I grew up helping my grandmother in the kitchen, and how I had adapted her recipes to American tastes. Sarah smiled and said, "That's so sweet. You must really miss your grandmother." And here is where everything went wrong. I wanted to say, yes, she passed away 3 years ago, but she taught me everything I know. Instead, I said, she sleeps 3 years ago, but she teach me everything. The room went silent. Mark's face froze. David and Sarah exchanged this look, a look I had learned to recognize too well. It wasn't pity. It was discomfort. They didn't know how to respond to my broken English. Mark jumped in quickly, explaining what I meant, but the damage was done. I felt my face burn red, my stomach twist into knots. I excused myself to the kitchen, where I stood over the sink, gripping the counter, trying not to cry. And that's when I heard it, Mark saying to David and Sarah, "She's still learning." The language barrier is tough sometimes. Language barrier. Those two words hit me harder than any insult ever could. In my mind, language barrier meant I was insufficient. It meant I wasn't smart enough, good enough, American enough. What I didn't realize then was that Mark wasn't embarrassed by me, he was trying to protect me. But my brain, clouded with shame, interpreted his words as rejection. When he came into the kitchen afterward, trying to comfort me, I pulled away. "Don't worry," I said coldly, "I know my English is bad." He looked wounded. "That's not what I meant, babe." But I didn't listen. I shut down. And that is when the silence between us truly began, not because he stopped talking, but because I stopped hearing what he was actually saying. After that night, I threw myself into learning English with an obsessive intensity that scared even me. I watched grammar videos for hours. I practiced pronunciation until my tongue hurt. I forced myself to speak perfectly, to eliminate my accent, to become someone else entirely. But in trying to sound more American, I was losing myself. And the more I changed, the further Mark and I drifted apart. Until one day, he looked at me with sadness in his eyes and said 3 words I'll never forget, words that made me realize I was going about everything the wrong way. What did he say? You'll find out in the next part, because that moment changed everything about how I thought about love, language, and learning. Why American silence is not the same as Vietnamese silence, the cultural trap. If you're watching this and you've ever been in a relationship with someone from a different culture, you probably already know what I'm about to say, but let me say it anyway, because it took me years to understand. Silence in America is not the same as silence in Vietnam. I know that sounds obvious, but when you're living it, when you're drowning in it, the obvious things become invisible. Mark's silence after the dinner party wasn't anger. It wasn't rejection. It was something I had never encountered in my Vietnamese upbringing, American decompression. In my culture, if someone goes quiet, something is wrong. You ask, you prod, you fix it. In his culture, quiet means I'm processing, I need space, or sometimes, I just don't have anything to say. And that last one? That was the hardest for me to accept. Because in my mind, how could the man I love have nothing to say to me? Was I that boring? That unimportant? I started journaling my frustrations, writing in English to practice, and I noticed a pattern. Every single entry was about what Mark was doing wrong. What he wasn't giving me, what I needed him to change. I had turned my marriage into a list of complaints, and my English was just giving me more words to complain with. That was a devastating realization. I was learning vocabulary to express my unhappiness, instead of learning how to express my needs in a way he could actually understand. So I did something that felt terrifying. I asked Mark to sit down with me and explain American communication. Not to be my teacher, but to be my translator. He laughed nervously and said, "This is weird, babe." But he agreed. And that conversation changed everything. He told me something I'll never forget. In America, we don't always need to talk. Sometimes, just existing next to someone is the connection. You're okay. I'm okay. The silence is okay. I wanted to scream. Okay was not a word that existed in my emotional vocabulary. In Vietnam, okay meant I'm tolerating this, not I'm happy. But Mark wasn't Vietnamese. He was American. And I was constantly using my Vietnamese emotional dictionary to translate his American words. No wonder I was getting everything wrong. That was the moment I realized, learning English wasn't about memorizing verbs and conjugations. It was about learning an entirely new way of feeling. It was about understanding that the word love might mean the same thing, but the way you show it, hear it, and express it can be so different that it might as well be a foreign language. I started listening differently. Not to his words, but to his pauses. Not to his explanations, but to his body language. And when I stopped interpreting his silence through my cultural filter, I started to understand something else, something he had been trying to tell me for months. A truth so simple, so painful, and so hopeful, that I nearly missed it entirely. What was that truth? You'll find out in the next part, because it changed not just how I saw him, but how I saw myself and every single word I had ever spoken in English. The silent treatment that almost destroyed us, when I nearly gave up. Picture this, you're lying in bed next to the person you love most in the world, and yet you feel completely, utterly alone. That was my reality for months after the dinner party disaster. Mark's silence wasn't hostile, it was worse. It was indifferent. He would come home, kiss my forehead like I was a piece of furniture he was fond of, and retreat to his man cave to play video games or watch sports. I started keeping track, 37 minutes of conversation per day, maximum. Most of it about groceries, bills, and whether we needed more toilet paper. I was starving for connection, for words, for anything that made me feel seen. And the more I chased him with questions, the more he retreated. It was a vicious cycle that I didn't know how to break. I started spending hours on YouTube, not just watching English lessons, but watching American couples, trying to understand what they did differently. I watched vlogs, relationship advice, even reality TV, anything to decode the mystery of the American marriage. And you know what I found? Nothing. Because every couple is different, and Mark wasn't just an American husband. He was Mark. And I had stopped seeing him as a person and started seeing him as a cultural stereotype that I needed to solve. That realization hit me like a truck one night when I was scrolling through my phone and found an old photo of us from our dating days. We were at a park, laughing, his arm around me, my head on his shoulder. I zoomed in on his face, and I saw something I had forgotten. He was looking at me like I was the most fascinating person in the world. What had changed? Had he changed, or had I? I started journaling again, But this time, instead of writing about what Mark was doing wrong, I wrote about what I was doing wrong. In my broken English, I scribbled, I make him feel like he is always failing. I am not his teacher. I am his wife. I ask too many questions. I don't listen. And then I wrote the most painful sentence of all, maybe he stopped talking because I stopped hearing. The tears came, not angry tears, not sad tears, but the kind of tears that come when you finally see yourself clearly. I had been so obsessed with perfecting my English, with sounding American, with being the perfect American wife, that I had forgotten how to just be present. I had forgotten that language is not just words, it's presence, patience, and the willingness to sit in the uncomfortable spaces without trying to fix them. I made a decision that night. I would stop asking questions. I would stop trying to force conversation. And for 1 week, I would simply exist next to Mark, in his American silence, and try to understand what it felt like instead of what it meant. But I had no idea how hard that would be, or what I would discover about him, about myself, and about the secret he had been carrying that had nothing to do with me at all. What secret? You'll find out in the next part, because what I learned changed everything about our marriage and everything about how I thought about love. The secret I discovered in my husband's silence, his hidden pain. Have you ever been so convinced that someone's behavior is about you, only to find out it was never about you at all? That's exactly what happened during that terrifying week when I decided to stop talking and just exist next to Mark. I thought I was going to discover a cold, distant man who had fallen out of love with me. What I actually discovered was something I never expected, a man drowning in his own quiet desperation, hiding a pain so deep he didn't even know how to name it in his own language, let alone in mine. The first day of my experiment was brutal. I came home from my part-time job at a local bookstore, and instead of asking Mark about his day, I simply smiled, made tea, and sat on the couch next to him. He glanced at me, confused. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. He waited for me to elaborate. I didn't. He went back to his phone, but I noticed something I had never noticed before. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. He wasn't relaxed. He was anxious. Day 2, same thing. I sat in the silence, sipping my tea, watching him watch the television, and slowly, I began to notice patterns. His leg bounced when the news came on. He glanced at his phone every few minutes, then put it down without responding. He sighed, not the sigh of annoyance I had always interpreted, but the sigh of someone carrying a weight they don't know how to put down. By day 4, the silence between us had changed. It wasn't cold anymore. It was cautious, curious, like two strangers trying to figure out if they could trust each other again. And then, on the 5th day, Mark broke the silence first. Not with words, with action. He came home from work and instead of retreating to his man cave, he sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He looked at me with those tired eyes and said, "Can I tell you something? Something I haven't told anyone?" My heart stopped. I nodded, terrified. And then he told me about the pressure at work, the fear of losing his job, the overwhelming anxiety that had been building for months. The feeling that he had to be the strong provider and couldn't show any weakness. He told me that my constant questions about his silence made him feel like even more of a failure. Like he was disappointing me on top of everything else. He said, "I stopped talking because I didn't want you to see me fall apart. But I think I'm falling apart anyway." I sat there in complete shock. All this time, I had been interpreting his silence as rejection, when it was actually a cry for help. He wasn't pulling away from me, he was drowning. And he didn't know how to ask for a life raft because he had been taught his whole life that men don't ask for help. In that moment, everything shifted. My obsession with learning perfect English suddenly felt so small, so irrelevant. The real language I needed to learn wasn't grammar or vocabulary, it was the language of emotional courage. And I realized that if I wanted to save my marriage, I had to stop trying to fix his silence and start learning how to sit with him in it. But the hardest part was yet to come, because fixing myself, my own fears, my own broken way of hearing him, was going to require a kind of learning that no textbook could ever teach. What happened next? You'll have to wait for the next part, because that's when the real transformation began, and it started with a single sentence in imperfect English. Learning English through my own story, the unconventional method that saved us. What if I told you that the best way to learn English isn't through grammar books, vocabulary apps, or even watching Netflix with subtitles? I know, that sounds like clickbait, but I'm serious. After Mark opened up about his work stress and the weight he'd been carrying alone, something fundamental shifted inside me. I realized that for years, I had been approaching English learning completely backward. I was treating it like a subject to be mastered, an exam to be passed, a checklist to be completed. But language isn't a destination, it's a bridge. And I had been so focused on making the bridge beautiful that I forgot I actually needed to cross it. So I tried something radical. I stopped studying English and started living it, but not the way you think. Instead of repeating vocabulary lists, I started writing my own story. Every night, I would sit down with a notebook and write about my day, my feelings, my fears, and my hopes. But here's the catch, I wrote it in the simplest English I could manage. No complex sentences. No fancy vocabulary. Just raw, honest, imperfect words. Today I feel sad. I miss my mother. But I also feel happy because Mark smiled at me. It felt stupid at first. Childish. Like a 5-year-old learning to string sentences together. But something magical happened. The more I wrote, the more I found my authentic voice in English. Not the voice of a perfect American woman, but the voice of a Vietnamese woman learning to express herself in a second language. And for the first time, I wasn't ashamed of my mistakes. I celebrated them. I realized that my broken English wasn't a sign of failure, it was proof that I was trying, and that trying was enough. I started reading my journal entries aloud to Mark. Not as performances, but as invitations. Listen to my story, I would say. Tell me if you understand. And he would listen, really listen, not just to correct my grammar, but to hear my heart. One night, I read him an entry I had written about how scared I was of losing him, and he cried. He actually cried. He said, "Your English isn't perfect, but the way you express yourself is more honest than most native speakers I know." That moment changed everything. I realized that my accent, my mistakes, my imperfect grammar, they were part of my story, not something to hide. I wasn't bad at English. I was learning. And learning is a process, not a competition. I started applying this to my listening and speaking too. Instead of obsessing over understanding every word in a conversation, I focused on understanding the emotion behind the words. I stopped asking "what does that mean?" and started asking "what does that feel like?" It transformed the way I listened to Mark. And it transformed the way he listened to me. We started having conversations that had nothing to do with perfect grammar and everything to do with perfect honesty. But then, just when we were finding our rhythm, something unexpected happened, something that would test everything we had rebuilt and teach me an even deeper lesson about love, language, and the beautiful mess of being human. What was it? You'll find out in the next part, because it involved a tiny human with a giant impact on both of us. The tiny human who changed everything, when love learned a new language. Imagine discovering you're going to be a mother, and instead of feeling pure joy, your first thought is, "How can I raise a bilingual child when I can barely speak one language properly?" That was me, staring at the pregnancy test in our Boston bathroom, my hands shaking, my mind racing with a million fears. I was terrified. Not of childbirth, not of the sleepless nights, but of something far more primal. What if my accent confused my child? What if my broken English made my baby feel ashamed of me? What if I couldn't communicate with my own child the way American mothers do? The anxiety hit me so hard I couldn't breathe. I had spent years feeling inadequate in my marriage. And now I was about to bring a tiny human into a world where I was still struggling to find my voice. I didn't tell Mark immediately. I needed time to process, to figure out how to express this enormous news in English that felt both honest and beautiful. That's when my journaling practice became my lifeline. I wrote and rewrote my pregnancy announcement, not in fancy English, but in the simplest, most heartfelt words I could find. We made a baby. I am happy and scared. I want to be a good mother. I hope you will be a good father. I love you. It wasn't Shakespeare, but it was me. That's when I realized that my journaling had become something far more powerful than a language exercise. It had become my emotional translator. Every fear, every hope, every messy feeling I couldn't articulate aloud, I could pour onto the page and then read to Mark. And when I finally sat him down and read my simple announcement, his reaction was not what I expected. He didn't laugh at my grammar. He didn't correct my pronunciation. He just pulled me into his arms, held me so tight I could barely breathe, and said, "I've never heard anything more beautiful in my entire life." And then he started crying, those deep, messy, ugly tears that men are too often taught to hide. We spent that whole night talking, not about grammar, not about accents, but about our dreams for this tiny human. Mark told me he hoped our child would be bilingual, that he wanted them to speak Vietnamese as well as English. That he was proud of me for not giving up. He said something that has stayed with me ever since. You think your English is broken, but it's not. It's just different. And different is beautiful. That night, something clicked in a way it never had before. I stopped apologizing for my accent. I stopped correcting myself mid-sentence. I stopped trying to sound like someone I wasn't. I started speaking my imperfect, honest, unpolished English, and to my surprise, people understood me better when I stopped trying to be perfect. I was learning English through my own story, through my own emotions, through my own fears, and it was working. But the real test was yet to come, because raising a bilingual child in America was about to teach me lessons about language, identity, and love that no textbook could ever contain. And it would bring Mark and me closer than we had ever been, but not before one more challenge threatened to tear us apart forever. What was that challenge? You'll discover it in the next part, because it involves a misunderstanding so ridiculous, it still makes me laugh and cry to this day. Love in two languages, the beautiful chaos of our bilingual family. Have you ever watched your child speak a language you barely understand and felt a strange mix of pride and panic? That was me, standing in our Boston living room, watching my 3-year-old daughter Mia switch effortlessly between English and Vietnamese like she was born fluent in both. She would say, "Mommy, I want some nuoc," mixing English and Vietnamese in a way that made my heart swell and my head spin. But then came the moment that terrified me. She asked me a question in English, and I didn't understand her. Not because I didn't know the words, but because she had used a phrase I had never heard before. Something her American friends at preschool had taught her. "Mommy, what's a bottoms up?" she asked with those big curious eyes. I froze. I had no idea what that meant. Was it a drink? A game? Something inappropriate? I felt that familiar wave of inadequacy wash over me, the same feeling I had at that disastrous dinner party years ago. But something was different now. Instead of spiraling into shame, I did something I never would have done before. I laughed. I said, "Mia, I don't know. Let's ask Daddy together." And together, we looked it up as a family, turning my ignorance into a learning moment for all of us. That was when I truly understood the gift of being a bilingual family. It wasn't about being perfect in either language. It was about being curious, humble, and willing to learn together. Mia grew up watching her mother struggle with English, and instead of being ashamed of me, she became my teacher. She would correct my pronunciation gently, saying, "Mommy, it's th-re, not tree," and I would repeat it until I got it right. I started reading children's books to her in English, not because I needed to practice, but because it was our special time together. And you know what? Those simple books taught me more English than any textbook ever did. The simple sentences, the repetition, the rhythmic patterns, they rewired my brain in a way that felt effortless and fun. Mark would watch us on the couch, Mia in my lap, reading aloud in my imperfect English, and he would smile. He told me later that those moments were when he fell in love with me all over again, not despite my accent, but because of it. He said, "You're the bravest person I know. You're raising a bilingual child in a country that isn't your own, and you're doing it with grace and humor." I almost cried. For so long, I had seen my accent, my mistakes, my imperfect English as weaknesses. But Mark and Mia taught me that they were actually my superpowers. They made me relatable, approachable, and real. They made my story unique. And they taught me that love doesn't need perfect grammar, it just needs honest expression. But then, just when I thought we had it all figured out, Mark surprised me with something that would change our family forever. Something that would take my English learning journey to an entirely new level. What was it? You'll find out in the final part, because this story has one last twist that will make you laugh, cry, and maybe even believe in love again. The Silence Was Never About Me, a love story rewritten in 2 languages. What if I told you that the silence that nearly destroyed my marriage was actually the greatest gift I ever received? I know that sounds crazy. For years, I saw Mark's quietness as rejection, his pauses as distance, his need for space as a lack of love. But here's the truth I discovered on the other side of that painful journey: Mark's silence was never about me. It was about him, his fears, his pressure, his American upbringing that taught him to be strong and silent. And my desperate need to fill that silence with words? That was about my own insecurities, my own fear of being invisible, my own belief that love had to be spoken to be real. The night Mark surprised me with the final twist of our story, everything came full circle. He came home from work with a small box in his hands. I assumed it was a gift for our daughter Mia, or maybe something for the house. But when he opened it, I saw something that made me gasp: a beautiful journal, leather-bound, with my name embossed on the cover. Inside, the first page was written in his handwriting, and it said, "Your story is the most beautiful one I've ever heard. Now it's my turn to write mine. For you. For us." He had been secretly journaling about his journey for months, just like I had. He wrote about his fears of being a good husband, his anxiety about providing for us, his guilt for not understanding my cultural needs better. And he wrote it all in the simplest English he could manage, not because he needed to practice, but because he wanted me to understand him the way I had taught him to understand me. That journal became our bridge. We would read each other's entries aloud, laugh at our mistakes, cry at our truths, and slowly, patiently, rebuild a marriage that had nearly crumbled. I learned to speak my truth in English without shame, and he learned to listen without judgment. Our daughter Mia grew up watching her parents struggle, fail, and try again, and that taught her more about resilience than any perfect family ever could. Today, Mark and I are stronger than ever. We're not perfect. We still have misunderstandings. Sometimes I still misuse a word and we laugh about it. Sometimes he still goes quiet and I have to remind myself that silence is not abandonment. But we have something we never had before, a shared language that goes beyond words. A language of patience, curiosity, and the courage to be imperfect together. And that, my friends, is the real secret to learning English. Not memorizing vocabulary lists or obsessing over grammar, but using your imperfect, honest, beautiful voice to tell your own story, and finding someone who wants to hear it, exactly as it is. So if you're watching this and feeling hopeless about your English, I want you to know something: your accent is not a flaw. Your mistakes are not failures. They are the fingerprints of your journey, and they make you unforgettable. So start writing your story today. One sentence. One imperfect, beautiful sentence at a time. Because somewhere out there, someone is waiting to hear it. And that someone might just be the person who needs your story more than you know. That's all for today. I'll make more videos like this in the future. Please subscribe to see them.